Thank you very much, Ruth, and it's a great pleasure to be with you all. Some people, when they go to a restaurant, order 2 appetizers rather than a main course, and I think that's the sort of big appetizers we've just had. I want to offer you a few thoughts to keep the conversation alive and to underline some of the things that have been talked about and to open up a few new dimensions. And I want to start by focusing on the law. So the decision to leave the EU has created an unprecedented situation for environmental law. What should our approach be? We could carry on as we have before, following the EU's lead. But we should instead think of how we can improve environmental law. How can we make it more effective and better enforced? How can we approach trade relations so that they drive up environmental standards around the world? And how can we lead by setting ever higher standards for the environment? The UK will have greater freedom to act than it did before, but more important than getting freedom is what we do with it. If we choose, we can lead. We can understand how other countries are facing up to environmental problems. We can learn what constitutes global best practice. We haven't been that great about that. And one of the exciting things for me in working in China is that when the Chinese decide that they're going to do something, they immediately look for global best practice and then bring it home with what they call Chinese characteristics. So I'm looking forward to an era in which we bring back global best practice and bring them in with British characteristics. And in doing so, we beat global best practice while making it our own. So 3 areas, then, I want to talk about. Environmental law, as I mentioned, trade deals, and setting high standards. First, let's look at the law. Environmental law flourishes when it is underpinned by access to justice and has good institutions. A time of uncertainty in the law, which we're entering, is a good time to go back to first principles. Here we ask, what is the point of environmental law? That one is simple: to protect and enhance the life of people and nature. But without proper enforcement, environmental laws are ineffective. Passing a law does not itself improve air quality or halt biodiversity decline. I sometimes think in past few decades, people would go to Brussels and pass a law and take a lot of credit. And then, as an Italian proverb puts it, come home to find a way around them. But when you pass a law and do not enforce it, you in effect authorize the conduct you sought to prohibit. We've had to take the UK government to court 3 times and win 3 times over air pollution, just to get the government to abide by rules it set itself as part of a participatory process in Brussels and then in the Parliament in London. So even before Brexit, we have laws that live only on paper, at least until citizens enforce them. I can give you an update on our air quality case, our most recent one, and I'm happy to say that the government has decided not to appeal the most recent victory. I hope this means, and the Secretary of State said this morning that he's going to come out with new policies in a few weeks. I'm very eager to see what they are. Now, the EU has been far from perfect at enforcing environmental law, but when we leave the EU, we lose, among other things, 2 key functions. We will lose the ability to make free complaints to an expert body, the European Commission, about the government's failure to comply with the law. And we will lose access to enforcement powers that can hurry along the government's actions when they're failing to comply. In our second Clean Air case, the government admitted that their timescale for cleaning up our toxic air was not the statutory deadline, but was instead based on their calculation of when the EU would start issuing fines. True. While that is clearly an unacceptable attitude, and the court said it was also an illegal attitude, the point remains that the threat of EU enforcement was motivational. After Brexit, we need to do better than we've done in recent years. This means designing a new institution that can hold the powerful to account and bring the underrepresented voices of people and nature into decision-making. The Secretary of State has promised us a new environmental watchdog. We need one that is able to effectively represent and fight for the interest of people and nature, one with both enough bark and bite. Otherwise, we'll be left with a government that can decide for itself when it has to comply with the law and when it doesn't. Remarkably, this was precisely the government's position before the Supreme Court in our first air quality case, that it was up to the government to decide when and if to comply with the law. That's not a path we want to go down. The government, too, must be bound by legal duties, and we must be very careful of this after Brexit. It's a great opportunity. The new body that we've been promised must be open to complaints from the public. Beyond that, it must proactively engage with NGOs and others to get their views on when compliance with the law is lacking. It must work with local communities and with experts. It needs to be owned by the public, not become another faceless bureaucracy. Its experts will need a range of skills, legal, but also scientific, technical, communications, and engagement skills. Most importantly, this body cannot be just another talking shop. It has to take the information it gathers and force the government to do better when it is not acting well. It must shine a light on public bodies that are failing to comply with the law. Its word must be loud, powerful, and respected. Where it can act collaboratively and cooperatively, so it should. But sometimes the government doesn't listen to reason. That's where the courts come in. To have bite, this new institution must be able to haul a public body into court, a public authority, before a court. But the story doesn't end in just entering court. What happens next is crucial. The reason we have to keep taking the government back to court on air quality is that they have not been taking the court's orders seriously enough. But another approach is possible, one we need to investigate and put into our new version of British sovereignty. Where a government continues to flagrantly breach its environmental obligations, the court should be able to issue specific, detailed, structural injunctions that require precise actions from the government. Then, the court needs to retain jurisdiction over the case until the government has complied with the injunction. In our most recent air quality case, the court did retain jurisdiction, a very important step forward in environmental cases in the UK, one much to be celebrated, and that's what the government decided not to appeal, which is a very positive thing. So when governments don't listen, the courts need to be able to make specific orders and to hold on to the government within the case until it has complied with them. Now, this approach is not novel when you look around the world. Courts in the United States, in India, and Pakistan in particular have been experimenting with and issuing such injunctions for, in some cases, decades. But it is a new approach here. The UK can adopt this approach, but add British characteristics by tying the court's injunctions to the specialist expertise of the body that has been established to defend and promote the interests of people and nature. The UK can lead by taking a more enlightened approach to litigation brought in the public interest, whether by the new body or by citizens, through greater supervision by the courts of government and all government actors when they don't comply with their mandatory duties. Not only will this enhance our environment, but it will demonstrate that the UK has international credibility. It will show that we mean to live up to our own commitments and can then expect others to do so too. Let's next consider what an environmentally, in the simplest terms, what an environmentally friendly approach to trade might look like. We are promised a new global trading regime that will rejuvenate British industry and reinstate the United Kingdom at the forefront of nations. Those visions are a bit blurry at the moment. Thank you. Agreeing frictionless trade with others means harmonizing our rules with theirs, whoever the trading partner is, including environmental rules. The UK will have a new form of sovereignty once we have left the EU. The government will have the ability to enter into new trade agreements, and it says that we will have taken back control of our laws. Entirely true. But the very act of making a trade agreement is, of course, a limitation of sovereignty. It limits what the signatories can and cannot do. It is a promise to enact and enforce certain laws. It is an agreement to pool some aspects of sovereignty with a trading partner, and to be mutually bound. No doubt there is a risk here to environmental law, a snake in the grass, or, may I venture, a chlorinated chicken in the field. That worked better than I expected, thank you. I had to try, for those of you who've been following American trade policy. Depending on who the UK chooses to do business with, we may have to adopt their rules and standards in order to be able to freely trade with them. This may include principles of underpinning legislation too, and in that regard, essential principles such as the precautionary principle, polluter pays, things that have been discussed today, must be retained in domestic legislation and used to guide the UK's future policy both internally and externally. Rather than the United States approach to chemicals regulation, for example, which makes it easier to sell potentially dangerous chemicals, we must keep a genuinely precautionary approach that considers the potential hazard of substances, both new and old. If the UK conducts its trade policy while thinking that environmental rules are an impediment to good international trade relations, then we will be making a grave error. The economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment, not vice versa. A green Brexit requires an international trade policy that positions environmental protection at its heart. How might this happen? A few simple ideas. We can refuse to trade with countries that do not participate adequately in international agreements like the Paris Accord or the Convention on Biological Diversity. We can, at least until they do, and we can use our trade as a lever to make them do so. We can integrate environmental protection throughout trade policy. Trade agreements often contain environment chapters that set out the rules. This is the place to put in the kinds of protections and mutual relationships that Ruth was mentioning earlier. And these would be a good start. Better would be to have environmental matters ingrained throughout trade policy. There should be a green seam that runs from negotiation to drafting to ratification to enforcement. Most importantly, we need to stay away from tribunals that allow companies to sue governments over environmental rules and remove tough rules and bring the rule of the trading partner down to the lowest common denominator. Many trade deals allow companies to bypass domestic courts and go to their own courts, to their own special, often secret corporate courts. Such courts are given the power in some trade deals, for example, the Canadian trade deal that the EU is in the process of entering into, to strike down environmental laws. Just recently, the European Court ruled that such practices are against EU law, and a case from Belgium is challenging the Canadian trade treaty in this respect. We should make such resort to these secret tribunals also illegal in UK law. Instead, we need to use trade restrictions to deter the lowering of environmental standards rather than letting tribunals lower our own standards. Let's finally consider how we may lead by standard setting. We can drive standards up, not down. We can ban dangerous and polluting practices and incentivize the best technology. Environmental problems are sometimes local and sometimes global. Even when they are local, they're often repeated across the globe. Look at how many cities in Europe and indeed around the world have dangerous levels of air pollution. When the UK and its constituent nations become free to act unilaterally, we can show the world how to design and promote better standards. For example, in sustainable transport, creating solutions that other countries also need. And this was referred to a few minutes ago. The technology exists and the private sector is ready. Electric cars are far more efficient and cleaner than petrol or diesel. Uptake is still low, but the government can change that with the right tax incentives and investment in electric charging infrastructure. In Norway, which has already introduced such policies, electric or hybrid cars enjoy a market share of 25% or higher. We welcome the Automated and Electric Vehicles Bill currently going through the Lords. I share the government's aim to put the UK at the front of the pack in developing and using these new technologies. But as it stands, the bill is a missed opportunity and should be amended in at least 3 ways. First, we have to do more to increase the number of charging points. I hear all of the time that I would buy an electric car. Somebody will tell me, if only I could charge it, but I can't. Only 5 local authorities have used funding offered by central government so far to install on-street charge points. Why not require that all new or renovated non-residential buildings have a charging point for every 10 parking spaces? Second, we should do what they have already done in California, 12 other American states, Ontario, or rather Quebec, and China, which is the gold standard in this regard. In these places, manufacturers have been mandated to ensure a percentage of vehicles sold are low-emission vehicles. This would not cost taxpayers and would mean the UK competes internationally. I read recently that the relatively new Chinese standards will mean that by 2020, about 5% of all cars sold in China will be ultra-low emission cars. As the Joint Select Committee into Air Quality has said today in what's really a historic report, we should bring forward the target to phase out diesel and petrol vehicles from 2040, where it now stands. Britain already lags behind other countries. The Netherlands is 2030. India and China, I understand, are considering 2030 as well. Scotland has already committed to ban the sale of petrol and diesel vehicles by 2032. Bringing forward the combustion engine ban in the rest of the UK would give a very clear signal to the automotive industry that they need to switch to cleaner modes of transport as soon as possible. Electric vehicles need not be the preserve of the rich either, and we don't need to wait until 2030 or 2040 for that. A recently introduced pilot program in California that was brought in to improve air quality has incentives aimed at getting old polluting vehicles off the roads while putting low-income drivers behind the wheels of clean cars. The program from the California Air Resources Board works by providing increasingly larger cash payments to the lowest income families to move up to the very cleanest cars. If you're one of the very poorest people in Los Angeles in one of the dirtiest neighborhoods, you essentially get a free second-hand Prius, which is remarkable. And the California authorities have calculated that this produces a net benefit to the economy. If we want to lead the world, these are the kinds of forward-thinking policies we need. We should be leading the world in clean air legislation, too. As the Joint Select Committee also recommended, we need a new Clean Air Act to achieve the widest possible health benefits by bringing into UK law the newest World Health Organization air quality standards. But it's not always about new and high-tech. And I want to end by talking about some softer measures near to my heart. Sometimes the old ways are the best. We can work with nature by planting more trees to absorb pollution in cities. The Committee on Climate Change recommended a much stepped-up tree planting program in the UK, and we fully support that. This would not only absorb pollution, but prevent soil erosion, retain floodwater, and ideas like natural flood management can be a cheap tool to reduce flooding in towns and cities, the sort of flooding that will become much more frequent as our climate continues to heat up. Working with nature to solve problems also provides habitat, restores natural areas, and provides natural settings that recent studies show are vital for the maintenance and improvement of mental health. High standards mean happy, healthy, and connected people. Our local and global environments are key to this. We in the UK can have high environmental standards after Brexit if we choose. Leading in this area will require investment, though. New ideas need to be tested and developed. Fortunately, the UK has research institutions that are up to this challenge and can take the lead in designing ideas fit for the 21st century. Science needs funding after Brexit. And if you're a devotee of the world's greatest science publication, which is a UK publication, Nature, you will have been following that the science needs attention after Brexit if we're going to maintain our technological lead. We punch far above our weight in terms of attracting EU funding for science, and the difference needs to be made up if we're going to stay ahead. With the right funding and priorities, our institutions can develop ideas that will help reverse the environmental trends that both surprised and caught up with us in the 20th century. And we shouldn't keep these ideas to ourselves. Going back to the notion of export, we need to export our ideas, our high standards, and a firm commitment to establish, ingrain, and enforce environmental law around the world. Thank you for your attention.